Now, earlier this week, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the appointment of former Deputy Minister of Finance, Mcebisi Jonas, as South Africa's Special Envoy to the United States. Jonas is set to lead negotiations, hopefully foster strategic partnerships, and even engage with the United States government officials as well as private sector leaders. His appointment comes at a time when relations between South Africa and the United States administration are probably at an all-time low. That's, of course, due to recent tensions over differing views, if we want to call it that, on geopolitical matters, as well as economic policies. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Christoper Isike. Prof, thank you so much for the time. Good to chat to you again then. What have you made of this appointment? Let's get your overall arching view here. Many seem to think, well, he's actually the right person for the job.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for having me again. You are correct. Look, my first impression was for the president not to even make any kind of appointment in the first place until we have seen the U.S. play its hand. So now that they've appointed an ambassador, my thinking is that the president would want to use Mcebisi Jonas' appointment to negotiate for his acceptance, and use the U.S. ambassador's appointment to negotiate for Jonas' acceptance. And once that is done, then it creates a pathway for both governments to start talking to each other. One of the things that has not happened since January.
But then, does this mean that the relationship is actually going to work? Because if we're still strong and we're still tied up, is this the right move to actually have set up somebody to hopefully change the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa, when the U.S. itself, yes, they've appointed their own person as well to South Africa, but isn't that where the relationship is going to have to start then?
Well, for there to be a relationship, there has to be engagement and discussions between both countries. Right now, there is none. The U.S. Appointing an ambassador to South Africa is an indication of their intention to continue to relate with South Africa. And what South Africa is then doing is to meet them at an even keel by also appointing an envoy to start off those conversations and engagements.
So they've also maintained that they're not going to be sending anybody to the G20 summit here in South Africa, even later on this year as well. Then, could this ultimately change, do you think, off the back of an ambassador from the US to South Africa, and then us having this envoy, then, Mcebisi Jonas?
Well, they said they would not attend any of the ministers' forums, early this year, but then they changed their mind and sent, although junior level officers, but there was some representation. The U.S. is beginning to also understand that removing itself from these multilateral forums is at its own peril. It's actually forcing its former partners that they've alienated to the hands of the competition, which in this case would be China. So they can't say that now, but it can change at any point in time, especially with an erratic president. However, like you've asked, I think that once relations begin to normalize a bit between both countries, that could also be a signal of better things to come in terms of attending the G20 in November.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see whether that actually does come to the fore. Prof, what about the past? And unfortunately, that does come up. I mean, a lot of people have said a lot of things over the past. I mean, Donald Trump himself, the president of the US, has said some things that we all can question then from the past. It being brought to life now, he's still president of the US. We have a similar situation, however, with the former deputy finance minister having said things about former or current president of the US, Donald Trump then. Does that begin to resonate at all, do you think?
Well, Donald Trump is a politician. Mcebisi Jonas is also a politician. Politicians say things. If you want to begin to judge politicians by everything they say, you may not have anyone to talk to in the world. So I don't think that what he has said before as a private citizen will count, now. However, we must also know that he's a very principled man, steeped in ANC policies and struggle, but also he's a businessman, something that Trump likes, right? And we must also know that Trump does not respect weak people, weak in quotes, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
He respects people who are able to hold their own. And I think that Mr. Jonas is one of those personalities that will be able to hold his ground in the US, starting with discussions with Marco Rubio until he eventually gets to talk with Trump.
Is this the last chance saloon? As in, this is the only thing we've got left? If this fails in terms of trying to mend relationships, there might be no other way to do it other than maybe President Cyril Ramaphosa himself trying to make way to the US.
Well, this may not be the only way. Remember that South Africa still has critical minerals that the US is interested in. And now with China blocking some of its critical mineral sales to the US will increasingly look to countries like South Africa to supply its needs. So this is a trump card that South Africa holds. And I think that the president is playing this very carefully, very slowly. Eventually, they will have to meet each other at some point. I don't think that Mr. Jonas' appointment is the last card, and that if it fails, all else fails. My thinking is that I'm predicting that if he does this job of getting both countries to engage fruitfully well, he may then transform into becoming South Africa's ambassador to the United States.
That's actually going to be an interesting one as well, bringing him back to the forefront then of SA politics in quite a major way, especially a role like that. Tell me what's the difference, though, between what Ibrahim Rasool had spoken about with regards to Donald Trump and what maybe, Mcebisi Jonas had spoken about, fine, in his private capacity, but how does that differ in any way with how the US might see both?
Well, the difference is that Mcebisi Jonas, when he said what he said, was not the ambassador of South Africa to the US, was not speaking in an official capacity. That matters, that counts. If he was ambassador of South Africa to the US and said the same things that Rasool said, he probably have gotten the same treatment. So it's about the position you hold at the moment and the fact that an ambassador, for example, represents the views of the government in power. And I think that difference should be something that we tend to look at. One of the cardinal principles of being an ambassador is not to attack or get involved in the direct politics or the home politics of your host country. And so when he made his comments in 2018, this was not his position at the moment. And of course, positions can change. Donald Trump is not immune from constantly changing positions as well.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly done that over the last couple of years. One just looks at Elon Musk as well as being a part of his cabinet. I mean, he's changed his ideology on electric vehicles as well, just being a big part of it. Is there a chance then of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State then in the United States, Mcebisi Jonas coming to the fore, meeting, shaking hands? And what does this mean for treaties and alliances and things like AGOA, for example? Do you still see that being very significant and still staying in South Africa's context, especially because it's been so beneficial to us?
Well, to the first part of your question, look, I think this is why the president is making this appointment at this time. The fact that the US has appointed Bozell as its ambassador, there are processes based on the Geneva protocols. There are processes that both countries have to engage in to agree on for South Africa to accept the appointment of Bozell as the US ambassador. Now, in that process, the part of that discussion can be South Africa to also say, look, we're not going to appoint one now. We will accept this person you are sending to us if you would accept an envoy. And if the US accepts that and both countries then agree on that, then it can signal the beginning of those handshakes you're talking about. At that point, Marco Rubio, who seems to be very powerful in terms of America's foreign policy, would have no choice but to agree to the terms of that agreement, because South Africa can actually refuse the appointment of that ambassador. So if both countries agree, then Mr. Marco Rubio will be forced to accept Jonas, and those handshakes can occur. They may not be in public at the initial stages, right? And then to the second part of your question about AGOA, I think we must accept that AGOA is off the table. It's not just a South African thing. It's the foreign policy focus of the United States to do bilateral engagements, trade engagements with countries, rather than a collective approach that AGOA enables. So it will be country by country based, and I think that beyond AGOA, there are benefits, there are other trade engagements between South Africa and the United States that we tend to undermine because of the clear benefits that come out from AGOA. So I think we should focus on those bilateral engagements, while South Africa also tends to look at other markets like the African Free Trade Area, within the continent, for diversifying its trade portfolio.
Professor Christoper Isike, thank you so much for the time. We're also going to forgive you. As a Manchester United fan, we'll forgive you for trying to invoke the spirit of 2004 and 2005, because it will be very difficult to see how that helps for your Champions League pursuit. But all the best. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Professor Christoper Isike, University of Pretoria Director for African Center for the Study of the United States.